Thank you all for joining us tonight. This presentation is being recorded and going live on Facebook. Please keep your microphone turned off, and it's your choice to turn on your camera or not. Any questions for the presenter can be put in the chat box. As we are going live on Facebook, would you please put in the chat how many people are watching with you and where you're joining us from, and we would appreciate it. I'm Rochelle Collins, and I'd like to welcome you to Evening Sessions, which is a twice-monthly adult program series featuring a fun and engaging mix of presentations, lectures, workshops, demonstrations, authors' visits, and performances on topics covering the arts, culture, history, science, and more. Our next evening sessions on April 7th will be Copper Miners, Trials and Tribulations in 1913 in Michigan's Copper Country, presented by Donna Simons, author of The Copper Empire. You can learn about the 1913 copper strike in the Upper Peninsula and learn how the tragedy led to a Christmas Eve, tragedy. You can learn about the BCLS programs by subscribing to our newsletter on our homepage and by asking a librarian the next time you call to request a book. This evening's program is a virtual tour of Hell's Half Mile with Sam Fitzpatrick from the Bay County Historical Society. Thanks for being here, Sam.
Thanks for having me. Glad to be here. Oh, my old neighbor's on here. Hello, Josh Diener.
And you can start anytime, Sam.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get started, and just be sure to leave your questions or comments or anything in the chat log, and I'll open up the floor to that once this is once we're all through. So, all right, I'm going to share my screen. Okay, 1 second. Okay, all right, I'm going to minimize that. All right, can everyone see my screen? Oh, I can't hear you all, but Rochelle, can you? Okay.
Yes.
Oh, okay, sorry. All right, guys. So thanks for coming out for this tonight. It's been a while since I've done this in person, and I've never done a virtual Hell's Half Mile tour, so I'm pretty excited to do this. So again, this is the virtual tour of Hell's Half Mile, which was Bay City's notorious red light district. My name is Samuel Fitzpatrick. I am the education coordinator at the Historical Museum of Bay County. I'll give you guys a tour, kind of describe what it was like, the characters in the street, and more. And real quick, the Bay County Historical Society is located in downtown Bay City at 321 Washington Avenue. We're right next door to City Hall, so that beautiful Victorian clock tower next door to us. When we're open, we offer walking tours, museum tours, virtual and in-person education. The virtual stuff's pretty new, so I'm still working on that, and I'll be working on that more once I get back into the office. We have free monthly second Saturday programming, a gift shop, a research library, and more. And real quick, this is the tour route. So this is an overhead bird's eye view of the Water Street District in downtown Bay City. So the length of the tour is about a mile total. So it's a half mile from number 1 down there, that's the museum, and stops 6 through 12. That's the intersection of 3rd and Water Street. That's kind of that's why there's a big cluster of people and events there that I talk about, because a lot happened there. It's kind of the epicenter of Hell's Half Mile. And then from there, we kind of start walking back south towards the museum. And when people take my tour in person, we give out these flyers for people to keep, so they can kind of keep up where they're at and learn a little bit too. All right, so real quick, I do want to let it be known that I went out a few days ago when it was nice out and took my own pictures of the tour stops. Because the museum's closed, I wasn't able to get a lot of historical photos, but I do have this one available on my computer. And a little bit of background introduction here. So this is Water Street looking north. And to give you guys an idea of where this was taken, that building here to the right, that 4-story building, that is the Fraser Home Hotel. The very next intersection to the right, that's Center and Water. So that's the old Mill End building you're seeing there. All these buildings to the left here no longer exist, but now we have Winona Park and the band shell. And then to the immediate left, out of frame, would be where the DoubleTree Hotel now stands. The Fraser House, that burned down. In its place was the Winona Hotel, which burned down in the 1970s, and that's now the current location of the Delta College Planetarium. So to give you an idea and a sense of where this picture was taken, that's right in the middle of downtown. Okay, so I'll go ahead and dive in. So Bay City today is known for its recent renaissance, coffee shops, restaurants, boutiques, vibrant waterfront community, just all around fun stuff, a lot of cool things happening right now. 140 years ago, this was a very, very, very different city, particularly the Water Street district. Between the Civil War and the turn of the 20th century, lumber was everything to the Saginaw Valley. It made some men millionaires, as seen by the historic homes on Center Avenue and the adjacent areas, especially as you're closer to downtown. A lot of people that profited from the selling of munitions during the Civil War moved north to places like Bay City and bought large swaths of timberland that could then be harvested and sold. The Saginaw River, because of this lumber boom, was soon dotted with sawmills everywhere from the mouth of the Saginaw River all the way down to the city of Saginaw to the south. The lumber fields of central and northern Michigan employed between 5,000 to 10,000 workers, and during the spring thaw, they partook in their vices and poisons in towns like Bay City, but mostly Bay City from what I understand. These guys came from all over Michigan, other parts of the US, Canada, and as far away as Europe to work by felling timber, which is cutting trees down. So there's quite a mixture of men and cultures all working, drinking, and fighting and having a good time all in one area. And Bay City was the closest city that contained two things you could not find in lumber camps: whiskey and women. Shanty boys and lumbermen would come down in search of both in droves. They really wanted to see the Bells of Water Street, as they were called. And once spring hit, so depending on when spring ended, a week or so of spending frivolously, so they would spend their entire season's paycheck. They would have to then pick up farm work or work at a nearby sawmill to make ends meet throughout the rest of the warm months until winter showed up, and then they could head back up north into the timber fields if they survived. So spending frivolously, they would earn anywhere between, this is in 1870s dollars, anywhere between $100 to $150 total for the felling season, which was between November and March, April. And I think this isn't exact, you'd have to pull up an inflation calculator, but I looked at it once and it was about $1750 for 5 months, and then in 2 weeks to just blow it all. So on women, on hotels, on drinks, on gambling, on food, and then they'd be back broke and they'd have to re-up for the next season. This is the story of crime, liquor, and prostitution. And if that wasn't enough, that was with knives, fists, and in some cases, teeth. Prostitution here was actually tolerated by law enforcement. It wasn't totally legal, but it was tolerated because it was actually good for the economy. It's impossible to tell just how many women, and I'm sure there were some male gigolos in there too, were employed by this, as it was not a taxable income, so there are no records of it outside of, say, newspaper articles or court cases, and there were a few. But it's estimated to be anywhere in the hundreds. And one of the books I read, which I'll talk about later on in this tour, estimated that in the 1870s between Bay City and East Saginaw, so like Bay City, Saginaw was once two separate cities, there was about 1,400 prostitutes. So a lot of people were employed by this. This is the story of Hell's Half Mile, which is a red light district running north-south along Water Street and the accompanying areas. As many as 5,000 lumbermen would hit the town annually during downtime. So the east side of Bay City, which was Bay City at this point, West Bay City was the other side of the river, there was a population of about 25,000 people. So you would notice if an extra 5,000 people just showed up in your town, and specifically this area. It was a chaotic time of year. And this was about late March, early April, again, depends on whenever the spring thaw came. Between 1855 and 1875, Michigan was a dry state, but the law was rarely enforced and very unpopular. The police forces here were significantly understaffed, and a lot of police work relied on brute force alone. Laws such as prohibiting the sales of alcohol to those under the age of 15 or closing saloons on Sundays were in writing, but were also unpopular and rarely enforced. The saloons back in these days were considered the social gathering places of the neighborhood. So theaters, gambling rooms, billiards, brothels, rented rooms, and even restaurants were all found here, and sometimes under one roof. It is said that the music, dancing, and fighting could be seen and heard here 24 hours a day, 7 days a week during the spring thaw period. And just as a warning, this tour does have some information that is colorful and violent and may contain some adult situations, but history is rarely squeaky clean, as we're about to see. All right, so we're walking from the museum right now over to the intersection of Saginaw and 7th near the one-way. And the first story I'm going to tell you about today is about the Social Saloon and Kit or Kate Lapham. In my sources, she kind of went as both names. I think it was probably whatever they heard when they recorded her name. Some heard Kit, some heard Cat, same person. So the Social Saloon was one of many saloons that made up Hell's Half Mile, and it was frequently referenced as being among the most notorious and dirty in the area. It stood closer to where the Comfort Inn meets the parking lot over there. I couldn't get any closer where I was standing. It was cold and windy, and on the tour stop, I oftentimes have to apologize because we have 3 lanes of traffic right there, and it's pretty loud. So for safety reasons, I keep people at this spot, but and it stays more in line with the tour. But anywho, Kit or Kate Lapham, as she was sometimes called, was seen here smashing windows out with a club, wearing nothing but red undergarments in broad daylight by passing policemen. It was also reported that her face was badly scratched and bleeding from a previous altercation. It was also observed that other furniture inside had been badly damaged or turned over. Her lover, Ed Tierney, knocked her down and struck her in the face, which is why she was bleeding. When the policeman came up and asked her, "Lady, what in blazes are you doing? It's broad daylight and you're naked." She said, quote, "If I cannot get satisfaction out of the proprietor, I will out of his property." Something happened between her and Ed where he couldn't please her, I guess, and they two got mad and got into a fight. Ed swore that he was done with her after this, and this was the last time, darn it, but this turned out to be a repeat issue between the couple. So Kit was closed and brought down to the station where she was charged for being drunk and sentenced to 20 days in jail. The notorious Kit Lapham is known by locals, and her court cases were watched closely by the residents of both the Bay Cities, as whenever it involved her, the details were juicy. So that whenever something in the news would show up about her, everybody would tune in. It was nowadays a couple like this would be on Jerry Springer. Let's put it that way. A court case ensued where Ed Tierney denied he had ever done such a thing to her despite her face being slashed, and it was probably scarring at this point. Ironically, Ed was the one to bail her out, so she didn't get to serve her whole sentence because Ed bailed her out. And this came as no surprise to locals, as it turns out there was a history of these two fighting, breaking up, making up, getting back together, repeat. Kit was also a kleptomaniac, so she was arrested for stealing things such as gold watches, money, and jewelry. Once, angered that she had been arrested, she screamed, yelled, and cursed so loud the entire police station could hear her. The Bay City Times even reported on this incident and said, quote, "The vile talk in which the woman indulged in was something shocking." All right. I'm sorry if I talk too fast, just let me know, I'll slow down. Okay, so our second tour stop here takes us to the intersection of Saginaw and Center, right in the heart of downtown. And this is probably the most brutal fight I found in all of my research. So just as a warning, some of the stuff's pretty gruesome. So this fight involved 2 shanty boys by the name of Jack O'Brien and John White, who both coincidentally hailed from Goderic, Ontario. One night in a nearby saloon by this intersection, words were exchanged and a fight broke out between them. The two took the fight outside, where O'Brien pushed White to the ground, jumped on top of him, clenched his teeth onto White's lower lip, and bit it clear off. He pulled it off with his own teeth and spit his lip off to the side. Officer Samuel M. Catlin arrived on the scene after hearing the scuffle. O'Brien, whose face was now covered in White's blood, got up and spit White's blood from his mouth onto Officer Catlin's feet. Before Catlin could do anything, another lumberman by the name of McFadden, who happened to be nearby, probably watching the fight, jumped at the officer and started attacking him. Catlin swung him around and got on top of him in a chokehold. The fight soon drained from McFadden, and soon more officers came to the scene, some latching onto McFadden and others helping with the bloody, kicking, screaming mess that was White's. As gruesome as that was, fortunately, White's lip was fixed using some makeshift surgery, which probably wasn't the most hygienic of the day. McFadden was charged a whole $40, and O'Brien was sent to the Detroit House of Corrections. Incidents like these were commonplace here and did not always end in arrest. A lot of times, people fought to the death, or they just got away with it because there was so few police officers, which I'll explain that more later. So Jack O'Brien himself had a lengthy arrest record and spent time in the local jail. This is a pretty small fight, considering that sometimes 20 to 30 jacks could be seen brawling in the street at any given time, and there often wasn't an occasion. They just did it. It was just the thing to do. Okay, so walking about a half block up closer to the water, I'm going to talk about James Baker and his Ladies Lounge, and it's probably not what you're thinking of. So James Baker owned the New Crescent Lunch Counter and Ladies Lounge at 805 North Water Street. And this is the approximate location, so probably where one of the condos are now in the Mill End Lofts. Surprisingly, James Baker did not serve alcohol, he did not serve tobacco, and he didn't serve men. He only served women. He wanted to give the ladies of Water Street a respite to escape from the rowdiness and chaos of the era and just wanted them to generally feel safe. James Baker himself, before he came to Bay City, was quite the human. He was African American, and he was born to a mother that was enslaved in Virginia. When James was old enough, he joined the Union Army and enlisted in the 1st Rhode Island Colored Battery and saw action in Baton Rouge, Hilton Head, and Beaufort Island. After the war, he moved north to Detroit, then he moved to Saginaw, and then in 1865, probably later 1865, he moved to Bay City, and he opened up a barbershop in the South End on the southwest corner of 35th and Water, which remained in operation for about 12 years. He himself lived on Broadway between 33rd and 34th Streets. If his name is familiar, his son, Oscar Baker, and grandson, Oscar Baker Jr., went on to become successful Bay City attorneys and founded the Baker Law Firm. All right, so in the same vicinity and probably just across the street, we had the St. James Restaurant / Saloon. So this restaurant supposedly had a secret underground sporting room where drunken lumbermen watched other drunken lumbermen fight each other. I like to joke and say it was a secret fighting area, so I joke and say this was a 19th century version of Fight Club. If anyone's seen the movie with Ed Norton or Brad Pitt, it's a cult classic. I love that movie. Paddy Corrigan, an Irishman, happy St. Patrick's Day, everybody, going by the name Paddy the Pig or Paddy the Dog, would frequent this room often, and he really wasn't the best character. And he would get so drunk for the right price, he would get down on all fours and fight dogs and rats using his teeth. It was reported that he had a very scarred and pockmarked face from doing so. And he was very popular with police, not for good reasons, but because they arrested him frequently for doing this. Often men like Paddy were advised to please leave town when they were released from jail, but he never really did. I don't know what his ultimate fate was, but I really hope he stopped fighting animals. The restaurant's bartender, John Matisse, aka Canada Jack, was a notorious person in Hell's Half Mile and Oakland County before coming to Bay City. In Pontiac, he was charged with attempted murder, and he once incited a riot in Holly at a circus in 1881. Then he came to Hell's Half Mile. He also ran his own bar on 12th Street and headed the 12th Street Gang, as it was called. And his bar was used to brainstorm a string of robberies in the area, and they were also known for harboring criminals from the police. He was once accused of attempted robbery of a local meat market in Bay City and even attempted to blow the safe open using dynamite. However, Canada Jack did not always get away with everything. Once, after attending a Buffalo Bills show in Saginaw, he entered the saloon and then threatened to scalp everyone inside after having a couple drinks. Fortunately, this was enough to scare someone to alert the police. They went to go grab the police. By the time the police got here, he had gotten more drunk and was then threatening to whip the whole crowd. Fortunately, he never did any of that, and he was hauled off to jail. On his way to jail, an unknown assailant, probably taking some vigilante justice, ran up behind him and clubbed him in the head and ran off. He got away with it. However, John survived the attack, and he lived to see another day. Later on, the 12th Street Gang was busted in 1884, and Canada Jack was sentenced to 3 years in the Jackson prison in Jackson, Michigan. I'll grab a drink of water real quick. All right, so half a block north here, this is the approximate location. Oftentimes, I'll just have the approximate location if I don't have an exact location. Reason being, in my research, oftentimes sources wouldn't tell you exactly where they were. They would say northeast corner of such and such, near the intersection of this and that. And it's possible they either didn't have an address or the business was not long enough was not around long enough to be listed in the city directory, so it just missed it. Anywho, the Red Light Saloon was at this intersection. This is another notorious spot on Hell's Half Mile, and the story here is a little shorter and it's kind of cheeky. It goes to show that sometimes robbers are nice, or maybe even a little remorseful in this case. John Cobb frequented the Red Light Saloon. They had a lot of drinks and a lot of prostitutes there. Tonight, he was just having a drink at the bar when, for whatever reason, three men that he didn't know grabbed him and dragged him upstairs to a hotel room. While they were upstairs in the hotel room, they forced him down on the bed and then proceeded to waterboard him. So he was drowning, basically. He couldn't breathe. While he was coughing and struggling for air, the men reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet and stole $60 in cash and split it evenly amongst themselves. However, before they left, they were kind enough to put the wallet back in his pocket. So the men got away, and then poor John Cobb had to go downstairs soaking and shaking and had to explain to his bartender that I can't pay for my drink, sorry. I don't know what his fate was either, but I imagine the bartender wasn't too happy. The Red Light Saloon was reported in the Bay City Times as, quote, the resort of the lowest characters of both sexes has been the scene of robberies, fights, stabbings, low dances, and vile wickedness. In every raid upon the dives of the city, the Red Light was always sure to furnish its full quota of females. Sources like this would often say the words vile and wicked, so I'm sorry if I repeat that a lot. It's just what Bay City Times used to describe this whole area, basically. And they didn't really quite go into detail, but I don't think it leaves up much to the imagination. It was pretty gruesome. Okay. So now we are at the intersection of 3rd and Water, and there's quite a few stops and talking points that I have to talk about here. I'm going to talk about the Catacombs, and then I'm going to transition into prostitution. So the Catacombs was described as the toughest place on the Saginaw River. The name Catacombs was chosen due to the dark and seedy nature of the basement saloon beneath the European Hotel, which is the same building as St. Laurent Brothers. So this area is still technically standing, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. And these areas were left dark day and night and left so on purpose. This is perhaps, again, the most notorious and seedy location in all of Hell's Half Mile. This is the hell in Hell's Half Mile, let's put it that way. The basement is said where prostitutes did their business, dead bodies were disposed of, some thrown in the river. Some poor saps were doped by their bartender and left to wake up in the basement after being robbed, so you couldn't even trust your bartender. Garbage disposal, fights, or escaping arrest by hiding in. There is also said to be an entrance from the 3rd Street Bridge for prostitutes to use. Underneath, one could make out orgies, gambling, robberies, violent crimes, etc., as the Bay City Times put it, quote, for woe to the police officer who alone would attempt a raid upon the Catacombs. It was virtually as much as his life was worth. So if you were running from the police and you ran into the Catacomb Saloon, chances are he wouldn't follow you. He valued his life and he wasn't paid enough. And again, I'll explain more about police work later. But something that I want to talk about that a lot of people, I'm often asked this on tours. I'm often asked if we can go down into the tunnels underneath Bay City, and the answer is no, we cannot. Reason being, if they still exist, they're probably very dangerous to go into because they weren't built, there was no OSHA back then. They've either been caved in or filled in by future construction. In the 1970s, Bay City streets were widened. And there are some photos I found in the Bay City Times of, you can see they dug into the ground, into the foundation of some of the buildings in this area. And you can see these archways that would have been like doorways. And these are at the basement level, but you could access them from the outside. So what these were used for, these places were, other than saloons, a lot of them were kitchens. So their freight, their food, their ice in the winter was all saved down here. Freight, so horse carriages would drive into town. They would park in front of a restaurant or saloon, and then they would walk down a set of stairs into the basement that was you could access from the outside to store freight and goods. Well, during night or during the spring thaw, when this place was crazy, a lot of people would hide down there if they were running from the law. A lot of people would get murdered down there. A lot of people would take a prostitute down there and have some fun. Kitchens. This was another thing. They were also used for garbage disposal and trash. So during the winter months, and this is one thing I really like to stress, is the stench of Hell's Half Mile. We often like to joke or say that the sugar beets of Bay City smell really bad. I just tell myself it's peanut butter and it works. Try it out. I mean, I don't think it smells that bad, but just tell yourself it smells like just peanut butter and you'll be fine. The kitchens, so garbage disposal down here. So rotting vegetation and rotting meat left over from winter, whatever they didn't use, they would just throw away in the basement and it would freeze in the winter. During the spring and summer months, this stuff would heat up and rot and stink. Also, another thing, the lumbermen themselves probably stunk because they just spent 4 or 5 months in the woods. The prostitutes that were with these guys might also have stunk. I don't know how hygienic they were. Animal carcasses are another thing that lay around in the streets. So before cars, we had horse and buggies, and sometimes maybe you have to put a horse down, maybe the horse dies, and the carcass sits there until someone gets rid of it. Farmers would also have to bring in their livestock to town to either be auctioned or maybe to a butcher shop. So having a dead body, and if someone was murdered or killed and they were laying in the street, it would stink. So combine all this together, and Hell's Half Mile truly must have stunk awfully. I'm getting a little off track here, sorry. So yes, I will say this. I have seen one photo of a tunnel underneath Bay City, and if anyone has read Nicole Beauchamp's book, Haunted Bay City, there is a chapter in there that talks about the Sugar Block building, which is on Center and Adams, and there's a photo of the entrance of a tunnel going in a southeasterly direction towards the intersection of Center and Madison. The photo, it looks, you can see the wood is collapsing, the dirt is collapsing, it looks very dark and unlit, probably not too different from the way it was way back in the day. But the author wrote about how the person that went into this tunnel felt very uneasy and scared of it and just didn't really trust it. So again, if these tunnels do still exist, or if we do find them, and if it's even possible to go into them, we would probably have to sign a waiver. I'm guessing they really wouldn't be that safe. But anywho, back to the tour. So prostitution. Many women wanted to escape the boring farm life of Canada and New England, so they traveled west to Michigan to make a new life for themselves. The money a prostitute can make here was very easy and very good to make, but the lifestyle was not. So take Ella Vaughn, who came here from Lapeer. She was raised in a very well-to-do, educated family and became a waitress in Bay City. After a little bit of waitressing, she realized that prostitutes were making significantly more money than she was. So she probably quite literally threw in the towel and climbed up the economic ladder and became a prostitute. However, the lifestyle soon proved to be too much for her, and she developed an alcohol problem. So much that she was often arrested for public drunkenness. One night, after feeling depressed of being in a jail cell and being drunk and just not being satisfied with her life, she attempted to take her own life. She ripped up shards of her dress and made a makeshift noose. She threw the noose over the rafters in her jail cell, climbed on top of the chair, stuck her head through the noose, went to kick the chair over, and she got a second lease on life. The shards of her dress were too thin, and it ripped, and she fell to the floor. She fell asleep, woke up, and went right back out to being a prostitute the next day. Again, she kind of could have gone anywhere and done anything with her life, but for whatever reason, she chose to come here to Bay City. I do not know her ultimate fate, but part of me does feel bad for her. I kind of hope that she did find something better. Another is Lizzie Galligan, who was a prostitute on Hell's Half Mile and had a very fatal end of her life in March of 1874. She performed her duties on Water Street and was pretty well known with all the loggers here for obvious reasons. Once upon finding out she was pregnant, she decided she didn't only not want to be a mother, but she didn't want to be alive anymore. She was also having some issues here too. She swallowed 50 cents worth of morphine, thinking her death would come quickly and swiftly, but she could not have been more wrong. It came very slowly and painfully. During the last waking hours of her life, she was surrounded by doctors tending to her every need until she finally passed away in the night. Despite the medical attention going on to her, other prostitutes took their johns right around her and went upstairs to their rooms to perform. The show must go on. On a more positive note, one of the most well-known prostitutes in the area was Maggie Shea, or Mag Snay, as she's sometimes called. And she was described as Bay City's answer to Calamity Jane. One story claims that she deliberately drove her own horse carriage down Water Street, chasing after a man wildly, and then ran him over with intent of doing so. I'm not sure if he just skipped out on paying her. Excuse me. If he skipped out on paying her or if he tried to rip her off, I'm not sure, but she ran him over and she was on her merry way. Despite her wild side, she also had a very charitable side. So many of Bay City's poor and homeless were aided by her money. This is another reason prostitution was so well tolerated. If you were really successful, you could be almost philanthropic in a sense. So again, a blind eye was kind of turned to it because although prostitution was frowned upon, it was just that good for the economy back then. Okay, so the former location of the 3rd Street Bridge. This is where people crossed over from West Bay City into Hell's Half Mile on 3rd Street. There was also nearby docks for steamships and entrances to the Catacombs for women. The bridge once connected 3rd Street to Midland Street directly. It was built in the 1890s and collapsed in the 1970s. Officer Nathaniel N. Murphy was hired here in Bay City as a policeman in 1877 and given the bridge beat to patrol the lawlessness in this area. And this was a very strategic part of Hell's Half Mile, reason being there was a bridge that connected to another municipality, so you have a lot of people coming and going. You also have a lot of commerce and trade. Steamboats were docked here, so you had people coming here from out of town, from maybe down from Saginaw or from Alpena for the weekend or something. So you had a lot of people coming and going right here at this intersection. So it was a very strategic location for Hell's Half Mile. Officer Nathaniel N. Murphy served in the force for 37 years, and he was a big, bulky, strong Irishman. He even worked his way up to police chief. He also had a hand in the 12th Street gang bust that we mentioned earlier with Canada Jack. He used his size and strength to his advantages when it came to fighting the lawless, as there was often no other choice. Once the museum reopens, I encourage you guys to come in and check it out. In our Hell's Half Mile exhibit, we have a big photo of Nathaniel Murphy, and he is this big, brawny looking guy with a police uniform on. He has this big cocky smile in his picture. He was good at his job and he knew it. One evening, a giant fight broke out near the 3rd Street Bridge. The contestants were thrown out of a saloon onto the bridge's wooden platform. It is then reported that an additional 30 to 40 men formed a human ring around the men to let the fight continue. Murphy, seeing the ruckus, stormed through the manned ring and grabbed the 2 men fighting by the necks and shook them apart. However, it's then reported that the weight of the men on this section of the bridge soon proved to be too much, and this section collapsed through to the river and riverbank underneath. A lot of men were clamoring to get to shore. Some were drowning, some were swimming away, some were just confused. Nathaniel Murphy, being the strong guy that he was, got up, shook himself and the other guys off, and dragged them off kicking and screaming to jail. He was just a good officer, and probably one of the best on Hell's Half Mile. So pretty much in the same location, but turning right around, we're going to talk about Fabian Joe Fournier / Paul Bunyan, and yes, really, I'll explain. Probably the most famous personalities or legacies on Hell's Half Mile. Joe was described as the toughest man in town. He was the Bay City Times called him a noisy, quarrelsome fellow, drank considerably, and in all respects was a notorious tough, and they weren't wrong. He came to the Saginaw Valley in his teens and had 2 children and a wife. He lived in the Banks neighborhood, which is on the northwest side of the city. And traditionally, this is the French-Canadian neighborhood. He came here from Quebec, so he was among his fellow countrymen. However, he was no family man. He wasn't working in the lumber fields. He was drinking and fighting in Bay City. At a time when men's average height was a little over 5 foot, Joe stood at 6 feet tall, was outrageously strong, and even had 2 full rows of adult teeth. There is a real name for this disorder. It has a long Latin term that I can't pronounce, but if you Google it, it's kind of weird looking, but it's true. I think it affects less than 1% of the population, if I'm not wrong. He was also double jointed and very agile. He was known for his fast speed at which he could work and move with, and had very large hands, which you can see in that photo. He used his massive strength to his advantage, and he fought French style using his feet. So he used his feet, but they called it French style. I'm not sure why. His skull, being massive as well, was used as a battering ram, which he always caught opponents off guard by when he used it. But he did not fight in the lumber camps. He saved that for when he came to Bay City. mark his territory by biting off a chunk of wooden railings, wooden seats, wooden bars, anything wood, anything he could literally sink his teeth into except people. He wasn't like Patty. And whenever he would do this, he would proclaim, "That Joe Fournier, he's Mark," and point to it. And I'm not sure why the book that I used to pull that source from wrote it that way. I'm not sure if they were trying to write out a French Canadian accent, but I like to joke that maybe he was trying to talk through two full rows of teeth, and that put some strain on his tongue, making it difficult to pronounce words. I'm not a dentist, but if anyone here is, let me know. I'm curious. He was a heck of a worker, though. He was like Jekyll and Hyde, honestly. I mean, when he was in Bay City, he was awful. When he was in lumber fields, you wanted to be with Joe all the time. He guided many men to the lumber fields, and it was said they almost always filled their daily quota of lumber when they worked with him. He was the first guy up, the last guy to bed. He made sure his men were fed. He made sure they were safe. If you fell into the river, he would pull you out. If a tree was going to fall on you, he'd push you out of the way. He was just a good guy. He was sober, and maybe that was why. In 1875, Fournier boarded the Daniel Ball steamship at the 3rd Street dock that was headed up north along the Saginaw Bay to a popular picnic in the Au Gres area. Up there, Joe got very drunk and started fighting other lumbermen, other people. He even started fighting the band while they were playing. I guess he didn't like the music. On the way back, Joe was still full of himself, meaning he was drunk, and he started biting the ship's railing. So when Joe starts biting stuff, you know he's really drunk. He's really crazy now. Once it got back to Bay City and back at the 3rd Street dock, he walked ashore, and supposedly if people asked him where he was going, he said, "To hell." One of the men that accompanied Joe on this trip was a guy named Blinky Robertson. And he hated Joe. He decided, "I've had enough of Joe," and he took some vigilante justice here. So on the ship, before he left, he grabbed a ship carpenter's mallet, which is a very heavy mallet used by ship carpenters to probably hammer rivets in or fix anything else, and it could really do some damage to a person. So he grabbed it and chased after Joe down 3rd Street. Before Joe could even turn around to figure out what the heck was going on, he struck a fatal blow to Joe's head, cracked his skull open above his left ear, and Joe fell to the ground dead at age 27 on November 7th, 1875. However, Joe's life and death were so well known in the region, as soon as he died, word spread like a wildfire. This led to many to tell stories about his life and death around lumberyard campfires, thus creating a legend. So lumberyard campfires were common. The lumberjacks would do this at night or on their days off to just tell stories, have a good time, unwind, and just to pass the time. And they would talk about Joe a lot. And he wasn't the only tall French Canadian lumberjack, I'm sure. I'm sure there were other people that matched his description all over the Midwest and Canada. And people moved from lumber camp to lumber camp. Lumber yards they weren't stationary. They would just clear cut these big forests. That's why we don't see these big forests anymore. They literally cut them all down, minus a few spots in Michigan, of course. But and then they would move on to the next site. And it's possible that some men would move from camp to camp, depending on if they were able to. So many men, Joe working as a foreman, he had a lot of guys working under him that came and went to other places before and after working with Joe. And tall lumbermen in these days were given a French nickname. They were called a Bunyan, or in English, which is French. And in English, Bunyan translates to Good John. And this was named after a Frenchman who, during the Pompanoy Rebellion in Quebec, led a successful revolt against the British Redcoats. After this revolt, he then became a lumberman in Quebec. And Joe certainly fit this description, being a tall, strong, crazy French Canadian lumberjack. And by adding the name Paul, a common French name, Paul Bunyan was created. And Paul Bunyan is the anglicized or American pronunciation of Bunyan. I think Bunyan sounds cooler, but that's just me. And soon Fournier's stories were mixed up with other tales about the real Bunyan and probably some other people matching the description. And eventually they couldn't be told apart, and they all kind of warped into this one folklore figure called Paul Bunyan. And as the years went on, these stories got taller and taller and more exaggerated until we have the tall tale folklore legend of Paul Bunyan. Fortunately, a lot of Paul Bunyan's real attributes made it to the story. So being a tall, strong, hardworking lumberman, because he was, made it into the folklore. But his Hell's Half Mile, Bay City, drinking, fighting, biting stuff didn't make that into the folklore. So this was really interesting to research when I found this out. So many states claim to have the original Paul Bunyan, such as Wisconsin or Minnesota. Maine, but rightly so. He is Michigan, and more specifically, Bay City. I will give Quebec a pass because he's from there. So Paul Bunyan technically came here and actually died literally right here. All right. So the bridge block. This is more of a shorter stop. This is the block of saloons by the bridge, which is why it was called the bridge block. This was a two-story building on the north side of the street, which featured many saloons and dance halls. It's no longer standing. It was around before the St. Laurent Brothers building was built. There was also a dance hall on the second floor of this old building. Once there were too many drunken loggers jumping and dancing on the second floor. The bartender soon realized that they were exceeding their weight limit. They tried to get the men and women to stop dancing. Them being drunk, it only egged them on, so they danced and jumped harder until the floor collapsed down to the first floor below. There were many broken bones and curse words, and it certainly put an end to dancing here for quite a while. And I'm gonna go to the next slide, and I'm using the same picture, but we're in the same location. So I'm going to talk about Smith's European Hotel and then the New European Hotel. Smith's European Hotel and Restaurant was a two-story building here in this corner. European referred to the layout and floor plan of the building. It was similar to other European hotels of the mid-19th century. If anyone goes inside of Vino Restaurant on the west side, they have a photo of the interior of this restaurant. I'm one of the pillars in the center of the restaurant, I believe. This was known to cater to the most vile single women and men of the era. That building burned down, and after it was rebuilt into a three-story structure and branded the New European Hotel. Same owner, but it was newer because it was cleaner, quote unquote, from the previous establishment. This was more of a marketing ploy. As it was an advertising thing to get more people to come in saying, hey, we're not as dirty as we used to be, but that really was kind of a lie because this is Hell's Half Mile and a lot of places just weren't clean. And this is actually the very building that St. Laurent Brothers is in. Underneath that red facade, you'll see a beautiful commercial Italianate building. The third floor here was said to have held the Steamboat Saloon, Wine Room, and Variety Theater, which showed immoral plays and bawdy entertainment. And the main floor held an additional 3 saloons. Now getting back to the Catacombs. So Steve, the owner of St. Laurent's, was kind enough to bring me into the building because he caught wind I was doing these tours and he wanted to show me certain parts of the room. My cat just woke up, so if he meows, I apologize. And you can actually see evidence along the walls in certain floors of the room where bars used to be. You can see this black line that used to be where the table connected to the wall, or there's portions of the room that look like a window into a kitchen or into a serving area. And in the basement, which was where the Catacomb Saloon was, in the basement wall facing Water Street, so facing east, you can see those archways I was talking about earlier, and they've been bricked up. And there's about 3 or 4 of them, and they're short. So again, average height was shorter back then, so they come up to me about right here. And this is where freight would be brought in for goods and services, and where people would probably hide in to do illegal things in. Okay, so we're still in this same intersection, and again, a lot happened here. I'm going to talk about the Bay County Christian Endeavor Union, which was said to be near 3rd and Water Streets, so around this location. And pictured here, I believe, is the former Atrium restaurant. And the Bay County Christian Endeavor Union was, it goes to show that not everywhere in Hell's Half Mile was a troublesome place. So this was a place to lure lumbermen and women away from those terrible drinking places. Meetings were held here for people all around Bay County and taught them to turn to Christianity and taught others to follow, and so on and so on. They wanted sinners to find the morality in them and move away from their sinful nature and offer training on how to better serve God. Guest speakers came here from Bay City, Flint, and Detroit, amongst many areas to speak. By 1875, the Red Ribbon Crusade had hit Bay City, which was a part of the Anti-Saloon League. Men and women wore red ribbons or sashes on their clothes to show that they had chosen the rightful path of sobriety. By 1877, there is nearly a 900-member basis in Bay City alone. Despite the popularity and the numbers, and even managing to put several saloons out of business, in 1882, Bay City had 131 saloons up and running. The movement had died. John Fitzmaurice was a former priest and journalist who came to Bay City from East Saginaw to work in the temperance movement. His speeches were said to make thousands sign up, and he even wrote a book called The Shanty Boy, or Life in a Lumber Camp, which detailed the ruthless and rough lives of lumbermen in Michigan and Wisconsin. It may have also helped to spread the information about the sin and debauchery of Bay City, especially in a paragraph where he referred to people on Hell's Half Mile as wild and unsettled characters, and he wasn't wrong. If anyone's interested, his book is available on Google Books, and I think you can still pick it up in print. It's interesting stuff to read. So swaying in the other direction, we have the Campbell House, which is still standing. This is the Bay City Antique Mall. This building was built in 1868. It had it still has 3 stories, and at one point it had 100 hotel rooms. The main floor here featured offices, a billiard room, and a reading room. The saloon here was just as bad as anywhere else we're about to see, and for a whole $2 a day, you could have stayed here. I zoomed in. If you note the picture at the bottom right hand of the screen, you can still see the word Campbell faintly written on the side of the building for Campbell House. The Bay City Antique Mall is inside. It's a really cool place, and chances are you'll find some things and items that are from this very time period that we're talking about. Sorry. Okay, so the Charles Davis knife fight. So this is in an alleyway stretching between 3rd and 4th Streets, and going all the way up to Center. So for frame of reference, this brown building on the right, that's the Campbell House. And at the way, we're looking south from 3rd Street. So at the way other end of the alleyway is the Delta College Planetarium. So back here, in the bar, in the saloon inside the Campbell House, some drunken words were thrown around, push, turn, or shove. We all know what this leads to. Men gathered outside to watch a fight between Charles Davis and Martin Deloney. After some pushing and shoving outside, Charles whipped out a knife and slashed Martin's throat clean open. He then escaped to West Bay City via the 3rd Street Bridge because it was right around the corner, and he was later arrested. He also had a lengthy arrest record, so he was kind of a usual suspect in this case. Fortunately, police soon arrived to take Martin Deloney to see a doctor and get patched up. A lot of these fights ended in either death or arrest, and often doctors had to perform impromptu surgery on the spot in an attempt to save a life. They were not always successful. However, Martin survived this attack and was able to get his neck patched up and lived to see at least another day on Hell's Half Mile. If I were him, I would have gotten the heck out of Dodge, but again, some people just couldn't leave. They had an attachment here. All right, let me grab some water real quick. Okay. Okay, Old City Hall, which is a very cool bar and restaurant today on Saginaw Street. So this is Old City Hall because it was replaced by our newer City Hall, which is the Victorian Clock Tower next to the museum, which was built in the 1890s and designed by Pratt and Copey of Bay City. But getting back to Old City Hall, there's 2 stories I'm going to tell you about here. The first one involves an exotic animal trainer, and then I'm going to dive into police work and just kind of how crazy that was. So Dolly Hill, or going by the stage name Dolores Valencia, was an internationally known animal trainer hailing from New York who had an animal training studio above Old City Hall. She traveled the world's vaudeville circuits and trained her many animal acts. She trained pumas, dogs, leopards, mainly large cats, but she was no Joe Exotic. She was a lot nicer than that guy. She was a very passionate lover of animals and often pushed for their humane treatment, and she never authorized the use of a firearm around them. She never wanted them to feel spooked. She always wanted them to feel comfortable, and she wanted to avoid accidents at all costs. It was often reported that she was giving her wild animal shows at the Winona Beach Casino when that existed out on the Saginaw Bay, where State Park is now. Tragically, while training one of her 6 leopards, one of them leaped out towards her while she was distracted by another in a cage behind her. The leopard then clutched at her throat and slashed her windpipe clean open. It knocked her down, and while she was down, her screams were heard by an employee downstairs. That employee ran upstairs and managed to subdue the animal back with a pipe. He then looked at her to discover that her throat, back, arms, neck, and face were badly damaged, and the majority of her torso basically was bleeding out. Before able to alert the police, the employee decided he didn't like the sight of blood and fainted. A few moments later, he thankfully came to and rushed her to Mercy Hospital down the road. That was on a Friday when she was brought in. Over the weekend, she spent the weekend going in and out of consciousness until she succumbed to her wounds the following Monday. She passed away at age 42. She dedicated 25 years of her life to this practice, and she is buried at Elm Lawn Cemetery here in Bay City. And to dedicate that much of your life to something and to go out like that, I think is just very tragic. But anyway, transitioning back into police work. So even the police were not safe from the dangers of Hell's Half Mile. In fact, you were even more of a target because you were a policeman, and people just didn't like police back then. One night, Officer Ryan was on patrol near 6th and Water Streets, which is close to where the Doubletree Hotel is now, when for whatever reason, 5 men ran up from behind him, grabbed his arms, and started gagging him. They didn't grab his leg, so he was able to kick one of them in the stomach, which caused them to all drop him. He then pulled out his revolver and fired after them in chase. It's not known if he got any of them or arrested any of them, but interestingly enough, this is one of the only, if not the only story I have found involving a firearm on either side of the law. The police didn't have them for a while, and the people that came to Hell's Half Mile usually used their hands, their feet, their heads, knives, as we've seen, to defend themselves or cause chaos, cause ruckus. With large amounts of drunken brawls and lawlessness during the 1870s, a police force was needed to try to attempt, emphasis on attempt, to keep the peace. Often outnumbered, police were recruited based on height. Actually, they were always outnumbered, not just often, but the police were recruited based on height, size, strength, and how well they could fight. Brute force was used over most methods, so this was more of a vigilante force than a professionally trained force. Lots of these guys were former lumbermen themselves, so it takes one to know one, I guess. Coal miners, dock workers, and farmers from the area. They had to be tough enough to lick the tar out of anyone that dared disrespect the law. And they could be identified by a silver baton and a silver badge and a baton on their side. So they only wore civilian clothing. So they didn't even have a uniform. So you could easily impersonate an officer here, but that might be a death sentence. I really wouldn't have done that. By 1873, Bay City only had 14 officers. Less than 10% of the city's budget went to police work. To give you an idea of just how busy these guys were, between 1873 and 1874, there were 559 arrests for public drunkenness alone made in the city, not including the numerous other things you could be arrested for. So a lot of people quite literally got away with murder or anything else. By 1881, Police Marshal McCraney was accused of blackmail, running his own brothel despite having a wife at home, being drunk in public, and charging prostitutes $1 each, or being forced with a raid upon their brothel. So with what little money he made from his police salary, he certainly made up for by threatening prostitutes. The Bay City Common Council accused McCraney of corruption. Feeling the pressure, he resigned and moved to Minneapolis, where I guess they don't do background checks, and he became a police officer there. By the 1880s, it was realized, well, after this incident especially, it was realized that Bay City needed a better and more professional police force, received better funding, got uniforms, and I think got firearms too. All right, grab some water. Okay. So this is the last stop on our tour. We're back at the intersection of Center and Washington, and we're going to talk about the Westover Opera House. So the Westover Opera House was built in 1871 prior to the Phoenix Building, which currently occupies this space. This was one of the largest buildings in town, and like the Phoenix Building, it was also 5 stories. It featured vaudeville shows and seating for 900 on the main floor and an additional 600 in the gallery. It featured a dome ceiling with frescoes of popular stage productions in the day, and many plays and shows came here specifically for loggers' entertainment. This also held temperance lectures in the 1870s during the Red Ribbon Crusade, so John Fitzmaurice may have also come here to speak at this time. Kitty Leroy was known as the best jig dancer of the Saginaw Valley, who came into this building to dance. She was known for her many talents of popularity among loggers in both Bay City and Saginaw. She had an ankle that could turn any man's eyes, it was reported. Drunken loggers fresh from the woods would hoot, howl, whistle, and slam their fists at the table at her many talents. Though she was married and had a child in Bay City, she left town in 1872 and danced around the country. She followed the money. She went to the boomtown. She was smart. She had many men after her and eventually found herself in a love quarrel spanning multiple states. While in Texas, she fell in love with a barkeeper named Raymond, who accompanied her there for a few years. Then they moved west to California. After California, they moved back east to Deadwood in the Dakota Territory. Morris says hello. Okay. Where was I? Oh, when her and Raymond got to the Dakota Territory, the two separated for whatever reason. But Kitty didn't stay single for very long. While here, she met Samuel Curley, who was a card dealer, and they went up and got married. Shortly after the wedding, Samuel Curley left for Denver on business. However, as soon as he was gone, Kitty Leroy decided she was back in love with Raymond, and their love rekindled, and they got back together. And she didn't really bother to break up with him or divorce him or tell him that she was now his ex-wife. Being a very popular gal, word spread around like town like the wildfire. And as soon as Samuel Curley got back to town, he found out, became enraged, and swore he was going to do something about it. So he found the inn that she was staying in and asked the very naive innkeeper, who didn't know that they were now exes, if Kitty Leroy was staying at this inn. He said, "Yep, she's right upstairs." What happens next is as followed. Samuel Curley ran upstairs, knocked on her door. She answered. The two talked. Then there was a scream, a gunshot, and then a thud. A second later, there was a second gunshot and a second thud. The innkeeper ran upstairs to find that Kitty Leroy had been shot dead through the chest. Laying next to her was Samuel Curley, who had then committed suicide. It was then said that it took about 6 deputy sheriffs to keep the public out of the building while the bodies were examined. Kitty Leroy was very popular and quite famous at this time, so people were trying to see if she was really dead. Is this a publicity stunt? Can I get a lock of her hair, a shard of her dress? On other occasions, it was reported that outside of this work, Kitty Leroy was also a sharpshooter, a fighter, a card dealer, and she rode horses. She danced to the beat of her own drum. She loved you. She left you. She was an independent woman who was truly living her best life. She didn't really give a damn what anyone told her. She did whatever she wanted. She lived fast and died young. And like Joe, she was in her mid-20s when she died, but she had a very fulfilling life that ended tragically, unfortunately. There are a lot of stories of her adventures out west, but she got her start here in Saginaw and Bay City, and specifically at this corner. So this is going to conclude my virtual tour of Hell's Half Mile. I apologize if I went too fast. I know that was kind of an information dump. When I give walking tours, we have like a few minutes between tour stops to kind of decompress. So if anyone has any questions, I'll open the floor now. Also observe our social media links up here on the screen. We have a Facebook, a Twitter, an Instagram, and we also have a YouTube channel where we upload our previous Second Saturday productions.
All right, Sam, someone had asked the 2 books you mentioned, one was Nicole's. If you could mention the book's titles and the authors again, please.
Yes. So here, let me get back on the screen. Hang on. No. Okay, there I am. So yes, the first book I read, or one of the first books I mentioned was called Haunted Bay City, Michigan, and that's by Nicole Beauchamp. And that book, actually, I have it right here. That's a newer book that came out that talks about some of the history and hauntings of the Bay City area. Another book I read was called Terrible Timber Feller, which was talked about Joe Fournier's life, and that's how I found out that his stories were kind of blended into Paul Bunyan and some of the other things. And John Fitzmaurice his book was called Life in a Lumber Camp, or, no, wait a minute, I've already forgotten it. His was a longer title, but the author is John Fitzmaurice, and the full name of his book is The Shanty Boy, or Life in a Lumber Camp. And I think those are the only books I mentioned. D. Lawrence Rogers wrote the book Terrible Timber Feller. And there's a big picture of Joe Fournier on that cover.
It looks like we're going to have some people who are going to take the tour as soon as you're able to give it.
All right. Looking forward to it.
Does anybody else have any questions? Well, I have a question. You
Okay.
talked about the caves and the tunnels and stuff. Weren't they prone to flooding since we're so close to the water?
I would assume so. I want to say yes. I've actually never thought of that, but that's a good point. Definitely. So there are probably tunnels that have been boarded up because if they flooded, they probably would have caused sinkholes. And the last thing you would want as a business owner would be river water coming into your basement and you're 2 blocks away from the river. So, and I don't know if we can swim to any. I wouldn't want to swim in the river. But no, that I hate to be a letdown with some people, but no, we cannot go in the tunnels. As cool as I think that would be, excuse me, they're probably boarded up, and yes, prone to flooding if they haven't been boarded up by now.
It looks like a lot of people are saying thanks and great presentation and stuff, but I'm not seeing any questions. So if we don't have any more questions.
Does anybody have questions about the museum or me, or oh, Connie's raising her hand.
Connie, can you unmute?
Did you ever think about doing a tour of like the bootlegging days in Bay City?
I'm open to it. I'd have to research it. Being our location, I know I grew up in Saginaw. We had these rumors that Al Capone would park his boat on the. There's a rumor that he parked his boat and there was a tunnel going to the Shook. If anyone's familiar with that. I'm open to that. I mean, we're on the same river and we're not on the border. I know Port Huron, Detroit, there was a lot of that, but I'm open to it because there are other stories of people making bathtub beer during Prohibition in Bay City. I have researched a little bit of that. Given our location on the river in Lake Huron, there probably was some bootlegging going on. So I'm open to it. I would just have to research it.
Yeah.
Good idea.
Someone rich is saying that he was able to tour the basement at St. Laurent Brothers and he has some pictures. So I don't know if he wants to stop by when you guys open the building, the museum again. When do you think the museum is going to be open? I know it's running long.
I think we don't have an exact date yet, but I'm thinking April. And when I know an exact date, and we'll promote it when we know, but as of right now, we don't know. We have a lot of ongoing construction. So we're working on getting a new library. We were working on getting a new HVAC system. And we are having a new exhibit that's going to be installed. Our director, Mike Botchgalupo, made the announcement at our second Saturday that May or June, we're going to be having that new exhibit, but I'm thinking we'll be open before that. But when I know more, we'll be able to update people on an opening. I know we've been closed for a while and we appreciate your patience, but there are many good things coming. And I can't wait to get back to work, if you can't tell, but I love doing this stuff.
Okay, so it looks like there's no more questions. Sam, thanks a lot for coming. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Presentation, and look forward to taking the tour in person.
All right, looking forward to it. And
Sounds
sorry about those tech issues at the beginning.
That's okay.
Okay.
So everybody, we'll hope to see you in a couple weeks for the April program on the copper strike in the UP, and hope to see you then. Thanks for coming.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.